Hello, this is Brett Latham, and welcome back to Lathanomics. Today, we're going to talk about Krugman Module 50, efficiency and deadweight loss and consumer surplus and all that good kind of stuff. So let's get started. Okay, anytime there's a purchase, okay, consumer and producer surplus is created. You can see we've got where quantity supply equals quantity demanded right there. That gives us our equilibrium. Some people were willing to pay more. Some businesses were willing to supply the product for less. Okay, so find equilibrium, equilibrium price, above consumer surplus, below producer surplus. You need to draw that graph, label those surpluses. That's really really important. So if you need to, pause the video, draw this, price, quantity, doesn't really matter what, the numbers don't really matter, just make sure you have some kind of equilibrium mark. That's $30 and $1,000 if you want to, but make sure you get that drawn. Okay, the key is, once you're here, you cannot increase your gains for either party. Equilibrium's perfection. The market decides. That's what people want. That's what businesses want to make. We're using our resources effectively. Okay. Are there ever goods that are priced at an unfair price? Well, we have a lot of fairness things in our society, and we believe some things should be cheap, medicines, food, whatever, so poor people can afford them or so everybody can afford them. And it's like sometimes they're not. Okay? So equity and efficiency sometimes conflict. Supply and demand create efficiency. They don't necessarily create equity. So they can be in conflict. Okay? Most societies have a system of taxation. They tax people with more money. They give some of that money to poor people. And we believe it's more fair. Just fairer. Okay? Okay. So what kind of taxes do we have? You need to write these down, okay? Progressive tax. The higher the income, the higher the tax rate or percent. Okay? Regressive tax. The higher the income, the lower the tax rate. And then proportional tax is a fixed tax rate. Let's say you 10%. Everybody pays 10%. You make very little, you pay 10%. You make a lot, you pay 10%. So the person making a lot is paying more dollars, but they're paying the exact same rate. Quick examples: progressive tax. United States federal income tax, progressive. Higher income, higher tax rate. United States Social Security, regressive. We pay it on our first $100,000, $150,000. After that, there's no Social Security tax. So if you're a multimillionaire, your tax percentage for Social Security might only be 1% or 0.5% or maybe even 0.1%. Whereas if you're a poor working stiff, it actually comes out to about 12, 13%, plus there's some other stuff, Medicare tax on top of that. Okay? Proportional tax, a couple of states have straight up 3% on income. Doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. They figure 3% is pretty low. They want to keep it simple. They have that. It's also sometimes referred to as the fair tax or flat tax. So there's an example there. So make sure you have those things written down. Okay, another tax is the excise tax. This is especially important in economics. We use this a lot. Okay, excise taxes are on goods. Okay, goods or services. And examples of excise tax: gasoline has an excise tax, tobacco, alcohol, cell phones, hotel rooms, car rentals, all have excise taxes on them generally. Okay, tobacco and alcohol are referred to as sin taxes because it's like you're not actually supposed to use either one of those, so they tax it to reduce consumption, plus, of course, to collect taxes. Gasoline theoretically is taxed to replace roads, things like that. So that's that purpose. Hotel rooms and car rentals, they're taxed because they can make money off of them. Okay, remember, we've got consumer surplus, producer surplus. Here we've got a specific situation. Okay, at equilibrium, the price per gallon of gas is $2. Okay, and our surplus is, to calculate surplus, that's a triangle, right? So it's 1/2 times $3. 5 minus 2, that's $3, times 1 million, which is how many units are sold. So 1/2 times 3 times a million comes out to 1.5 million. Do the same thing for producers. Well, it's 0 to 2, right? So there's our 2. The 1/2, any triangle starts off with 1/2 base times height, right? So 1/2 times 2, the difference in price, times 1 million, and that comes out to a million. So our total surplus is 2.5 million. No excise tax, 2.5 million is surplus. That's our base. Okay, now, we have politicians in Smog City decide to impose a gasoline tax of $1. Who's going to pay the dollar? Okay, well, this is a really important concept in microeconomics. Okay, well, if the dollar was going to all be paid by the consumers, they charge 3. But that's not how it works out. In this situation, the new price is $2.60. Well, if you give the gas station $2.60 and they have to pay $1, then they only get $1.60. So remember the old price of $2? Well, 60 cents is being paid by the consumer. The other 40 cents is actually absorbed by the sellers. So we have a split, okay? The difference here is called a wedge, okay? And the wedge means the wedge between $2.60 and $1.60, the price paid by buyers and the price received by sellers. Now, what else happens? Well, we did sell 1 million. Now we're only selling 800,000, okay? The difference of 200,000 creates what we're going to call deadweight loss. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But that little area right there is the deadweight loss. It used to happen. It doesn't happen anymore. In addition, you can see consumer surplus is now up here and producer surplus is down here. So those numbers have changed too. Okay, so we're going to sell less. And by the way, since the producer is paying the tax, we've shifted supply. And I actually prefer, rather than up, left. Okay, so we shifted supply left. So that's bad. There's less supply. And it gives us a new equilibrium. Okay, so that's our situation. Now, who's paying the tax? Here's our details, kind of what we just talked about a little bit. 60 cents by us, right? We were paying 2. Now we're paying $2.60. 40 cents by the sellers. They were receiving 2. Now they're only receiving $1.60. Okay? Now, the sharing is called the tax incidence. Okay? Write that down. Okay? Tax incidence. If you're asking about the tax incidence, it'll be 60 cents by consumers, 40 cents by producers. In other words, it's shared. It's not one or the other. Okay? Now, we also know who pays the most more of it. Well, consumers do. 60 is greater than 40. That means demand is inelastic. Demand's relatively inelastic. Okay? If demand's relatively inelastic, consumers pay more. If it was relatively elastic, consumers would pay less. Okay, and you could do the same thing with supply. Relatively inelastic supply would mean suppliers paid more. Okay, so that's also important. So make sure you have those couple of things down. Okay, what if the buyers paid the tax? Well, if the buyers paid the tax, it would reduce demand. What would we end up with? Well, we'd end up exactly the same place. It doesn't matter whether the tax is on sellers or the tax is on buyers, except you're going to shift demand for buyers, supply for sellers, but you get to the exact same spot. 800,000, 260, 160, nothing changes. Buyers still pay 60 cents, sellers pay 40 cents. So whether the buyer or the seller pays the tax, actually writes the check for the tax, doesn't affect who really gets charged the tax. So you end up with the exact same situation. So don't let that confuse you. Okay, here in the book, there's a couple of nice little examples where they write things out, okay, and they're saying this, right? And make sure you have, the relatively inelastic, demand is relatively inelastic, buyer pays, supply is relatively inelastic, seller pays. Okay, but you can look at that. That might be helpful to you. Figure 50.9 in your book, same thing, might be helpful to you. Make sure you look at that. Okay, now, how much is the tax? Well, remember, we were going to sell 1 million units. We don't sell 1 million units anymore. We only sell 800,000 units. Okay, if we're only selling 800,000 units, well, then they can only collect taxes on 800,000 units. Okay, so we have 800,000. How much is the tax? Well, you don't need to worry about the 60 and 40. It's just $1, right? They're actually paying $1. So 800,000 times $1, $800,000. So the tax is 800,000. Okay, so let's do the calculations again. Remember, before we had 2.5 million, right here. 2.5 million. 1.5, 1.0, total at 2.5 million. That was prior to any excise tax. Now we have an excise tax. Okay? So the consumers right here is the surplus. Okay, and we've got our calculation. Same thing, a triangle. We've got a calculation. Comes out to $960,000. You can look at that, but trust me, it's $960,000. The new producer surplus, they only get $1.60. Comes out to $640,000. Add those two together. Okay, the tax revenue, we just said it's $800,000. Okay, that's the $800,000 right here. Add those three together, you get $2.4 million. This was $2.5 million. Where's the other 100,000? Excuse me. It's the deadweight loss. How big's that triangle? Well, we know it has to be $100,000. How do we know that? Because the total in here is $2.5 million, but we can also calculate it kind of the same way, right? Because you've got $1 difference here. You have 200,000 units difference. Well, 200,000 times 1 times, it's a triangle still, times 1/2 gives you 100,000. So when you add all that up, it comes up to $2.5 million. So does this one. Okay, so it really works. All right, moving on. We're going to go ahead. We're going to do a calculation. So what I'd like you to do, okay, this is 8, 6, 5, 4, 2. That's 60 units and 90 units. Draw this, answer these questions, pause the video, see what you can answer. Think back, check your notes, see if you can do it on your own without waiting for me to give you the answers. You'll learn a lot more that way. So pause the video. And we're back. Okay, so we have the current supply curve, current demand curve, calculate producer surplus before the tax. So we're going to ignore the tax. Producer surplus, we got equilibrium right here, 5 and 2. Okay, so that's 3. Number of units, 90. And all triangles are 1/2 times something. So 3 times 90 is 270. Half of 270 is 135. Okay, that's A. So hopefully you got that. Now assume a $2 tax is imposed, okay, and the impact shown. So this was a tax on the producers because they shifted supply. Okay, but remember that doesn't really matter when we do these calculations. Okay, so calculate the amount of the tax revenue. Okay, well the tax revenue, we already know it's $2. So it's going to be 1/2 times 2 times how many units are sold? Not 90, only 60. And so that's 60, right? Half of 2 is 1, so 60. Okay, what's the after-tax price that the sellers now keep? Well, it sells for $6. They have to give $2 to the government. That gives them $4. Calculate the producer surplus after the tax. Same type of calculations. 4 and 2 is 2, right? So 1/2 times 2 times, they sold a total of 60 units, not 90, 60 units, times 60, 1/2 and 2 cancels out. It's $60. Is the demand price elastic, inelastic, unit elastic between the prices of $55 and $6 explained? That one's from our last video or so. We're going to use the total revenue test. Okay, so initially, what was our total revenue? When we're just looking at the demand curve here, okay, just looking at the demand curve. So total revenue was $5 times 90. So old 5 times 90 is 450. Okay, that says 450. New, we raised the price, so the price is going to increase. We raised it to 6. The number of units drops from 90 to 60 times 60. 6 times 60 is 360. So the price increased, total revenue decreased. And remember, if price and total revenue, price goes up, total revenue goes up, that's inelastic. Well, in this case, they don't. Only one goes up. The other one goes down. They go opposite directions. Therefore, demand is elastic because price increased and total revenue decreased. That would be your explanation. Okay? Assuming no externalities, how does the tax affect? And we'll get to externalities later on, but let's just answer it based on what we know today. How does the tax affect allocative efficiency? Okay, it's less efficient or it's not efficient. Why? Because there's now deadweight loss. We were supposed to have these transactions. We don't have them anymore. The market would say we should have had them. They're gone. It's inefficient. Okay, now I'm going to flip through the official answers. You can pause for a second if you want to see something explained a little more thoroughly or more detail, or you want to copy something down. Okay, so you got your answer to A. That one's pretty simple. Okay, you got B, 1, 2, and 3. So you got a little calculation there. So if you need to pause, go for it. Okay, C, a couple of explanations. Use the total revenue test and some explanations. And D, excuse me, explanation. And something right here is really important, okay? Market's only efficient if the buyer and seller, the seller receives what the buyer is paying, which makes sense, right? Like if you're going to pay $5, I ought to receive $5. If there's a tax, we're no longer efficient. And so remember that. Any kind of excise tax creates inefficiencies. Okay, so that'd be a good thing to write down, but we'll move on. Okay, so you're answering the question. Read it, pause the video. Okay, and we're back. Okay, market equilibrium. Which of the following is true? Consumer surplus is maximized. Actually, just consumer surplus. That's actually false. You'd think it's like, I thought surplus was maximized. Not consumer surplus. Producer, nope. Total surplus, yeah, that's the one that's maximized. We can actually increase consumer surplus by creating a price ceiling, and we can decrease we can increase producer surplus by creating a price floor. We'll get to that later. So those aren't true, even though they make sense. They're not true, but total surplus is maximized at equilibrium. So that would be answer C. So number 2, total surplus can be increased by, we're already at equilibrium. How do we increase total surplus? Pause the video. And we're back. Okay. Reallocating consumption among consumers. Nah, that doesn't make any difference, right? People buy stuff. You're not going to do anything. Reallocating sales among sellers. Nope. Changing the quantity traded. We already said you need to be there. So the answer is none of the above. If a competitive market is in equilibrium, you cannot increase total surplus. Okay? Moving on. Which of the following is true regarding equity? And remember, we talked about equity and efficiency. So pause the video. Answer the question. And we're back. Okay, competitive markets ensure equity and efficiency. Nope, they ensure efficiency, not equity. Trade-off between equity and efficiency. That sounds good. I bet that's the answer. Lead to neither equity nor efficiency. Actually, they do lead to efficiency, just not equity. General agreement about the level of equity and efficiency in a market. Now, there never is, right? Everybody's going to argue about, is it fair? Is it good? So the answer is B. Number 4, an excise tax imposed on sellers. Okay, now we're distinguishing between sellers and buyers, okay? So pause the video, answer the question. And we're back. A leftward shift of the supply curve. Yeah, that's what we did, right? We shifted the supply curve left. Right, supply went to the left. Okay, a leftward shift of the demand curve. Now the demand curve is still right there, so no. Deadweight loss. Oh, yeah. Where's deadweight loss? It's right there. That's deadweight loss. 1 and 3, and lucky for us, D's an option. Okay? Moving on. Excise tax will be paid mainly by producers when. So when do producers incur the excise tax? This isn't writing the check. This is actually losing the money. So pause the video, answer the question. And we're back. Imposed on producers. Now remember that just tells you which curve to shift. Supply is relatively elastic. Now if it's elastic, then that's good for suppliers. So that's not it. Supply is relatively inelastic. Well, if that one's good, that one has to be bad. That's the answer. And the price, yeah, that's not the answer. That's actually, if it was perfectly elastic, the suppliers would actually pay nothing. Okay? In my class, at least, we're going to work another example, but we're not going to work it on this video. So that's it for today for Latham's Economics. So we'll see you next time.